The cold seeped through her thin jacket, not from the evening air, but from the unyielding marble steps of the mansion. Eleanor sat huddled, a silent statue of forgotten hope. At 8 months pregnant, every breath was a labor, every shift of weight a painful reminder of the life she carried and the world that had no room for them. She wasn't begging. Her eyes, shadowed with an exhaustion that went bone deep, were fixed on the ornate iron gates, not seeing the wealth beyond them, but searching for a memory that wasn't hers. Hunger was a familiar ache, a dull throb that had become the rhythm of her days, but the deeper hunger was for a sign, for one single crack in the fortress of indifference that surrounded her. She was invisible, a ghost haunting the doorstep of a life she could never touch. To the world that rushed past, she was a problem to be solved or, more easily, ignored. A woman in a tailored suit averted her gaze, her discomfort a palpable wave. A man walking his perfectly groomed poodle muttered something about the police, his words sharp stones thrown from a safe distance. They didn't see a young woman clinging to her mother's last words. They saw a stain on the pristine sidewalk, a threat to their orderly existence. They judged the worn-out shoes, the dirt beneath her fingernails, the desperate curve of her belly. In their eyes, she was a failure, a grifter, a tragedy of her own making. They couldn't know that her stillness was an act of profound courage, her presence a prayer whispered into the uncaring wind. Inside her, the baby stirred, a flutter of life that was both her reason and her terror. It was for this child that she endured the shame, the gnawing emptiness, the cold that threatened to extinguish the last ember of her spirit. Her hand instinctively cradled her stomach, a protective shield against the harsh glares and the city's heartless hum. In her tattered backpack, her only worldly possession, lay a faded photograph of a little girl in this very garden. It was the only proof she had that kindness once lived here. She wasn't seeking a handout. She was on a pilgrimage to the last sanctuary her mother had known, hoping its walls had absorbed some of that long-lost compassion. She wasn't asking for money. She was asking for a reason to believe. The mansion stood before her like a silent, stone-faced god, indifferent to her silent worship. Its windows were dark eyes, watching without seeing. The manicured lawn was a perfect, untouched paradise she could only view from her personal hell on the pavement. Every brick seemed to whisper of a security and warmth she had never known. Her mother had described this place as a haven, a pocket of gentleness in a cruel world. But to Elena, it felt like a monument to everything she had lost, everything she could never be. It was a beautiful prison, and she was stranded on the outside, a prisoner of a different kind, caged by poverty, by loneliness, by a love for a child who deserved so much more than this cold, hard ground. As dusk bled into night, the streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, making the world feel even more menacing. The warmth of the day was a distant memory, replaced by a damp chill that promised a long, difficult night. People disappeared into their warm homes, behind locked doors, leaving Elena to face the darkness alone. A profound sense of defeat washed over her, cold and heavy as a shroud. Yet, as she drew her knees closer to her chest, her fingers traced the outline of the photograph through the thin fabric of her bag. It was a tiny, fragile anchor in a raging sea. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to hold on to that image. For her child, she would endure one more night. She had to. The sun rose, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, but it brought no warmth to Eleanor. She had not moved. The cold marble steps had become a part of her, an extension of the world's indifference. When the mansion's sprinklers hissed to life, showering the perfect lawn, the mist that touched her face felt like a final, gentle mockery. She didn't flinch. She simply pulled the thin jacket tighter around her belly, a silent guardian of the life within. To the early morning joggers and the drivers of luxury cars, she was no longer just a sad figure from the night before. She was an installation, a stubborn, unsettling presence that refused to disappear with the darkness. Her stillness was an accusation, and they didn't know what crime they were being accused of. By mid-morning, the whispers had begun. A neighbor, peering from behind pristine white curtains, called the private security patrol. "There's a woman outside the Vega property," she reported, her voice laced with a sterile concern that was really just fear. "She's been there all night. She looks unstable." Soon, a sleek black car with a security logo pulled up. A man in a sharp uniform approached Elena, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning her for threats. He didn't ask if she was okay. He asked what she wanted. He saw a problem to be managed, a potential lawsuit, a blemish on the neighborhood's immaculate record. He saw a textbook case of a grifter playing the long game, and his job was to end it. Elena offered no explanation. Words were a currency she couldn't afford to waste on those who had already judged her. She simply shook her head, her gaze never leaving the iron gate. Her silence was her shield and her only weapon. The guard, frustrated, changed his tactic. He spoke to her as one would to a child or a madwoman, his voice a condescending drone. "Ma'am, you can't stay here. This is private property. You're making people uncomfortable." Each word was a small stone thrown at her dignity. She clutched the worn strap of her backpack, the photograph inside a secret source of strength. She wasn't trespassing on their property. She was standing on the hallowed ground of her mother's only happy memory. The situation escalated. The security guard, following protocol, made a call. Soon the quiet street was disturbed by the flashing lights of a police car. Two officers emerged, their faces etched with a familiar weariness. They had seen this story 100 times. To them, Elena was another statistic, another piece of human debris the system had failed to sweep away. They questioned her, their voices firm but not entirely unkind. Yet, in the eyes of the watching neighbors, the arrival of law enforcement validated their worst assumptions. She was a criminal, a public nuisance. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her, but she refused to crumble. She was not a vagrant. She was a pilgrim at a forgotten shrine. Inside the mansion, behind a wall of monitors, Adrian Vega watched the scene unfold. He saw the woman, the security guard, the police. He saw it all in crisp, high-definition black and white, a silent film of social decay playing out on his doorstep. He felt nothing, or rather he refused to feel anything. This woman was a disruption, a crack in the hermetically sealed fortress of his life. She was an untidy variable in an equation he had spent years perfecting. He didn't see her swollen belly or the exhaustion in her posture. He saw an illogical act of defiance that needed to be neutralized. He pressed a button on his intercom, his voice as cold and clear as glass. "Marcus, get rid of her. Offer her money. If she refuses, have her removed." Marcus, the head of security, returned to the sidewalk, this time holding a thick white envelope. He knelt, not out of compassion, but to be at her eye level, a negotiating tactic. "Look," he said, his voice a low murmur, "Mr. Vega doesn't want any trouble. There's $500 in here. Take it and go. Find a shelter. Get a hot meal. Just don't come back." He pushed the envelope toward her. It was a test, a final, cynical transaction meant to prove what they already believed, that everyone had a price, that her desperate vigil was just a performance, a prelude to a payday. For a moment, the entire street seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to grab the money and expose her true nature. But Elena didn't even glance at the envelope. Her eyes, for the first time, met the guard's. In them, there was no greed, no cunning, only a profound, bottomless sorrow. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The refusal was more powerful than any scream. It was a rejection not of the money, but of their entire worldview. It broke their narrative. If she didn't want money, what did she want? Her defiance was incomprehensible, and therefore terrifying. The guard stood up, defeated and unnerved. To him, and to everyone watching. Her action was no longer ambiguous. It was an act of madness. A woman 8 months pregnant, sleeping on concrete, refusing the very thing that could save her. The onlookers saw a broken mind. The police saw a stubborn case they'd have to process. The security guard saw a professional failure. No one saw the truth. They didn't see a daughter honoring her mother's last wish. They didn't see a soul clinging to the last ember of hope in a world determined to extinguish it. They saw a problem, a mystery, a threat. But Elena wasn't any of those things. She was a testament to a love so strong it could withstand hunger, cold, and the crushing weight of their judgment. She was waiting for a sign that kindness still existed. She just didn't know the kindness she sought was buried under 2 decades of guilt, watching her from a darkened window. If this story is touching you, like and share. So many people suffer in silence, judged by a world that doesn't know their story. The refusal echoed through the mansion's silent halls, not as a sound, but as a disruption in the sterile data streaming across Adrian Vega's monitors. He sat in his leather chair, a king in a kingdom of shadows and screens, the world outside reduced to a grid of silent, controllable images. His life was a fortress built of routine and logic, each minute accounted for, each interaction scripted. He had engineered an existence free from the messy unpredictability of human emotion. The mansion was not a home. It was a high-tech monastery where he worshipped at the altar of control, praying to a god of his own making. A god that promised no more surprises, no more pain, no more loss. But outside his gate, a variable he had not accounted for was quietly dismantling his entire system. He had first noticed her on the morning feed, a small, stubborn anomaly against the pristine geometry of his property line. He zoomed in, his eyes clinically assessing the data points: female, advanced pregnancy, destitute. His mind didn't process a human story, it processed a threat profile. She was a potential lawsuit, a public relations nightmare, a crack in the hermetic seal of his privacy. He felt nothing for her plight. Empathy was a liability he had surgically removed from his soul decades ago. To him, her suffering was a strategic problem to be managed, a piece of social debris that had washed up on his shore. He saw not a woman in pain, but a flaw in the world's design that had unfortunately manifested in his line of sight. With a cold, practiced calm, Adrian had pressed the intercom button connecting him to his head of security. His voice was a flat line, devoid of inflection. "Marcus, deal with the situation at the front gate." There was no need for further explanation. Deal with it was code for his standard operating procedure. Neutralize the disruption efficiently and quietly. First, offer money, the universal solvent for most of life's inconvenient problems. It was a simple, cynical transaction that almost always worked. If the offer was refused, it meant the problem was either more sophisticated or simply irrational. In either case, the next step was to escalate to bring in the authorities and let the official mechanisms of the system sweep the problem away. The moment she refused the envelope was the moment the encounter truly began. Adrian watched on the monitor as Elena shook her head, her gaze fixed not on the money but on something far beyond the guard's comprehension. Her rejection was not defiant, it was absolute. It was a quiet, powerful statement that she operated under a different set of laws, a different currency. For Adrian, this was incomprehensible. In his world, everyone had a price. Her refusal was an illogical act that his mind struggled to process, and the irritation it sparked was sharp and immediate. It was the anger of a mathematician whose perfect equation is suddenly contaminated by an impossible number. She was not playing by the rules, and it infuriated him. He stood up and walked to the vast floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the drive. From this height, she was just a small, huddled shape, but she was no longer just a problem on a screen. She was a real, physical presence staining his perfect view. This mansion was his sanctuary, but it was also his prison, a beautiful mausoleum dedicated to the memory of his sister, the ghost that haunted every room. His obsession with order was a desperate, lifelong penance for the one moment of chaos that had cost him everything. This woman, with her messy, unpredictable desperation, was a living embodiment of the world he had tried to shut out, a world where things could go horribly, irrevocably wrong. She was a threat to his grief. The police came and went. The security guards maintained their watch. The neighbors whispered behind their curtains. And through it all, Elena remained. Her stillness was an act of war against his controlled universe. Adrian felt a cold fury building inside him, a pressure behind his ribs. He was a man who moved markets with a single phone call, who built empires from lines of code. How could this one, insignificant woman hold him hostage with her silence? Her presence was a judgment, an accusation that his walls, his money, and his power were ultimately meaningless. She was a testament to a kind of strength he could not purchase or intimidate, and it made him feel profoundly, terrifyingly powerless. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the lawn. The clash was no longer just between a rich man and a poor woman. It was a battle between two opposing forces, his world of cold, hard logic and her world of intangible faith. He represented the system, the unfeeling machinery of power that sorts people into columns of assets and liabilities. She represented the stubborn, illogical resilience of the human heart, a force that cannot be quantified or deleted. Every minute she stayed, the gears of his perfect machine ground a little harder, straining against the unyielding softness of her hope. The world he had built to protect himself was proving to be a fragile cage. As darkness settled over the estate, Adrian found himself back in front of the monitors, unable to look away. The image of the pregnant woman, huddled alone against the encroaching night, began to pierce through his armor of indifference. It was not pity he felt, but a deep, unsettling curiosity. What could a person possibly want, if not money? What force was powerful enough to make someone endure such humiliation, such discomfort, for hours on end? For the first time in 20 years, a question about another human being had lodged itself in his mind. The worlds had collided, and though not a single word had been exchanged between them, the impact was already beginning to shatter the foundations of his own. The sun climbed higher, a merciless eye in a cloudless sky, but Elena felt no warmth. The world had narrowed to this patch of concrete, and the unblinking lenses of security cameras she could feel but not see. Her refusal of the money had changed the air. The guard's watchful stillness was now laced with a new kind of tension, a mix of suspicion and frustration. They saw her not as a person in need, but as a puzzle they couldn't solve, and it made them uneasy. Elena's resistance wasn't born of pride, but of a desperate need to protect the one thing she had left, her mother's truth. To take the money would be to admit her pilgrimage was a transaction, to sell the memory of kindness for a handful of bills, and so she waited, her body weakening, her resolve the only thing holding her together. Inside, Adrian Vega paced his office, a caged tiger in a gilded prison. Her refusal was a grain of sand in the gears of his perfect machine. He replayed the scene on his monitor, watching her shake her head at the envelope. It was illogical. It was inefficient. It was infuriatingly human. He had built his life on the principle that every problem had a price, a logical solution. This woman, with her silent, stubborn grief, was an anomaly that threatened his entire worldview. He felt an unfamiliar tremor of doubt, quickly suppressed by a wave of cold anger. He would not be defeated by this. It was a contest of wills, and he was a man who had never lost. He would simply wait. She would break, eventually. Everyone did. The whispers started among the staff. To them, the mansion was a sanctuary, a well-ordered universe with Mr. Vega as its distant, silent god. Eleanor was a disruption of that sacred order. She's mentally unstable, the housekeeper murmured to the cook. For you see her eyes, she's waiting for something. Marcus, the head of security, felt the pressure most acutely. He saw her as a ticking bomb. In his report to Adrian, his language was clinical but urgent. Sir, her continued presence is a significant liability. She's attracting attention. The neighbors are filing complaints. This is no longer a simple matter of trespassing. It's a public disturbance. We need to escalate. He was advocating for force, for the clean, impersonal hand of the law to sweep the problem away. Adrian ignored the reports. He found himself drawn to the monitors, mesmerized by her stillness. She was a ghost haunting the edge of his property, and her presence was beginning to stir the ghosts within him. He pulled up old digital photo albums, scrolling through images of a life before the silence, before the guilt. He saw his sister's bright, laughing face. He hadn't looked at these pictures in years. He felt a sharp stabbing pain in his chest, an old wound torn open. He slammed the laptop shut. This woman outside was the cause of this intrusion, this unwelcome wave of emotion. His resentment for her deepened. She was not just a nuisance, she was an infection, threatening the sterile environment he had so carefully constructed to keep his own pain at bay. The situation spiraled. A news van, alerted by a neighbor eager for drama, pulled up to the curb. A reporter with a microphone and a hungry look in her eyes began filming, her voice narrating a story of corporate greed and human suffering. We're live outside the palatial estate of tech billionaire Adrian Vega, where a homeless, heavily pregnant woman has been holding a silent vigil for over 24 hours, ignored by the man inside. The private battle had become a public spectacle. For Adrian, this was the ultimate violation. His fortress had been breached not by force, but by a story. He was no longer in control of the narrative. The world was now watching, judging him through the distorted lens of a television screen. For Elena, the arrival of the news crew was a new form of assault. The camera felt more invasive than any pair of eyes. The reporter shoved a microphone in her face, firing questions like bullets. "What's your name? Why are you here? Is it true he won't even speak to you? Tell us how you feel." Elena recoiled, turning her body to shield her belly from the lens, a purely maternal instinct. She said nothing. Her silence, once her shield, was now being interpreted for her. On screen, she was no longer a pilgrim on a sacred quest. She was a prop in a sensationalist story, her desperation packaged for mass consumption. The humiliation was absolute. She had sought a place of remembered kindness and found herself in a circus of public shame. Rage, cold and pure, flooded Adrian's system. He watched the reporter fabricate a narrative, turning his private property into a stage for a cheap morality play. He saw Elena not as a fellow victim of the media's intrusion, but as its cause. She had brought this plague upon his house, his carefully managed solitude. The one thing his fortune had been able to buy was shattered. He slammed his hand on the intercom, his voice a blade of ice. "Marcus, get them out. All of them. I don't care what it takes. Call the police. Have her arrested for harassment. Have them arrested for trespassing. End this. Now." This was no longer about logic or waiting her out. It was about reclaiming his power, about erasing the woman who had brought chaos to his door. Marcus and two other guards moved with grim purpose. The cameras rolled, capturing every moment. They formed a wall in front of Elena. "Ma'am, you are under private arrest for trespassing and harassment," Marcus stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "The police are on their way. You need to come with us now." The authority in his voice was absolute. Panic seized Elena. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This couldn't be happening. She tried to scramble to her feet to get away, but her legs, stiff from the cold and lack of food, buckled beneath her. She cried out, a small, desperate sound, clutching her worn backpack to her chest as she stumbled forward, losing her balance. The world tilted, a dizzying blur of angry faces and camera flashes. As she fell, one of the younger guards, his face barely out of his teens, instinctively reached out to catch her. His hand brushed her arm, a fleeting moment of unscripted humanity. For a split second, his eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not a uniform, but a flicker of fear and compassion. It was a tiny crack in the wall of hostility, but just as quickly it was gone. "Don't touch her," Marcus barked, his voice like a whip. "Protocol." The young guard snatched his hand back as if burned. The system had reasserted its control. The brief, aborted gesture of kindness only served to magnify the cruelty of the moment, a single drop of warmth in an ocean of ice. From his window, Adrian watched it all. He saw her fall. He saw his guard's reflexive act of decency and the swift, brutal correction from Marcus. He saw Elena on the ground, clinging to that pathetic backpack as if it were her own child. The sight should have brought him a sense of victory, of order being restored. Instead, he felt a hollow void. The woman was a problem, an irrational variable, a source of chaos. And yet, the image of her protecting that tattered bag with such fierce desperation lodged in his mind. It was the final, incomprehensible piece of the puzzle. He was about to turn away, to let the system he had set in motion run its course, but he couldn't. His eyes were fixed on that bag. "Do you believe in second chances? Comment below. We want to hear your voice." From the cold sanctuary of his office, Adrian Vega watched the chaos unfold with a grim sense of finality. On the monitor, the woman, the persistent, illogical variable, was finally being neutralized. His guards were moving in, their actions dictated by the protocol he himself had written. The police were waiting. The system was working. He felt a sliver of cold satisfaction, the quiet hum of a problem being solved. He had endured her silent siege, and now he was winning. She had forced his hand, brought the vulgar spectacle of the media to his door, and now she would face the consequences. He told himself this was justice. This was order being restored. He was merely erasing a flaw, a smudge on the pristine canvas of his life. Eleanor's cry was a thin, sharp sound that barely registered over the city's drone. As the guards moved to restrain her, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tilted, a nauseating blur of stern faces, flashing lights, and the cold, indifferent lens of a camera. She stumbled, her body too weak, too heavy with child, to fight back. Her hands, instinctively cradling her belly, let go of the one thing she'd held onto for days, the worn strap of her backpack. It slipped from her shoulder, hitting the concrete with a soft, pathetic thud. She fell to her knees, a gasp of pain and fear escaping her lips as the contents of her entire world spilled out onto the unforgiving pavement, exposed for all to see. It was a meager collection, a portrait of a life lived on the edge. A thin, frayed sweater, a small bottle of water, a half-eaten apple, and a well-worn copy of a children's book. The items scattered around her like lost memories, but amidst the debris, one object landed face up, distinct from the rest. It was a small, square photograph, its colors faded by time, its edges softened by years of being held. It lay there on the cold grey sidewalk, a fragile window into another time, another world. To the guards and the reporter, it was just another piece of trash. A piece of a story they had already written in their minds. They didn't even notice it, but Adrian, watching from above, did. His eyes, cold and analytical, had been tracking the guards' movements, ensuring their efficiency. But the small square of faded color on the screen snagged his attention. It was an anomaly in the grey landscape of the pavement. He leaned closer, tapping a command to zoom in, his irritation sharpening. What was it? What pathetic trinket was she clinging to now? The image on his high-definition monitor sharpened, the pixels resolving into a clear picture. For a moment, his mind didn't process what he was seeing. It was just an image. A garden, a tree, a splash of red. But it was a familiar image, one that resonated in a deep, forgotten part of his soul, and a cold dread began to crawl up his spine. Then, the world stopped. It was not just any garden. It was his garden. The ancient oak tree still stood by the west wall. The swing set, the one his father had built for her, was gone now, but he remembered exactly where it had been. And the splash of red, it was a ribbon, a bright red ribbon in the dark hair of a little girl. Her face turned away from the camera as she reached for a flower, a ghost, a memory he had locked away in the deepest vault of his heart. It was his sister. It was Leah. The air left his lungs in a silent rush, as if he had been punched. The sterile office, the monitors, the entire world he had built to protect himself from this exact feeling, dissolved into nothing. The photograph was a key, unlocking a door he had sealed shut 2 decades ago. The pain was not a memory, it was a fresh wound, raw and bleeding. He saw her face, heard her laugh, felt the warmth of her small hand in his. He was 17 again, standing by the pool, lost in a book for just a moment too long. The guilt, a monster he had starved for years, roared back to life, ravenous and all-consuming. His meticulously constructed reality shattered into a million pieces. The cold, logical billionaire was gone, replaced by a broken boy drowning in a sea of grief. He clutched the edge of his desk, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged, painful sobs that made no sound. And then another memory surfaced, pushing through the fog of his pain. A kind face, a soft voice, the nanny who had adored Leah, who had been more of a mother to her than their own. Sophia. Her name came to him like a whisper from the past. He remembered her quiet grief after the accident, the way she had held on to him before she left, her eyes full of a sorrow that mirrored his own. This woman on the pavement, clinging to a photograph of his lost sister. She couldn't be a stranger. She had to be Sophia's daughter. The realization was a lightning strike, illuminating everything. Her vigil wasn't an act of aggression, it was a pilgrimage. She hadn't come to take something. She had come searching for a memory of kindness. The immense, crushing weight of his cruelty fell upon him. He saw the last 2 days, not through the lens of a security problem, but through her eyes. The cold, the hunger, the humiliation. He had offered her money, assuming her pain had a price. He had sent guards and police, treating her dignity as a nuisance. He had watched her suffer from his gilded cage, feeling nothing but irritation, while she was honoring the only person he had ever truly loved. The shame was a physical force, burning through his veins, bringing him to his knees. He had become the very thing he despised, A man whose power made him blind, whose wealth made him cruel. He was the monster. Do you believe a single moment can change a person forever? Comment your thoughts below. He didn't think. He simply moved. A primal instinct took over, a desperate need to undo the damage, to stop the machine he had set in motion. He shoved himself away from the desk, stumbling as he ran from the office. He flew down the grander, silent staircase, his expensive shoes echoing in the empty hall. For 20 years, this house had been his tomb, a monument to his failure. Now, it was just a building, and he had to get out of it. He had to get to her. The guards, the police, the reporters, they were all part of the nightmare he had created. He fumbled with the lock on the massive front door, his hands shaking, his mind screaming a single, silent prayer. Let me not be too late. Outside, the scene was frozen in a tense tableau. Marcus had his hand on Elena's arm, preparing to lift her to her feet. The reporter was shouting questions, the camera light a blinding glare. Elena looked up, her face a mask of terror and defeat, and then the great oak door of the Vega mansion, a door that hadn't been opened to an uninvited guest in 2 decades, swung inward with a deafening creak. Adrian Vega stood on the threshold, a spectre in a tailored suit, his face ashen, his eyes wild with an emotion no one there could name. He looked past the guards, past the cameras, his gaze locking onto Elena, and with a voice raw with desperation, he shouted a single word that shattered the silence and stopped the world in its tracks. Stop! The word hung in the air, a command that reverberated with the force of a breaking dam. Adrian strode past his stunned security team, his movements sharp and urgent, his eyes fixed on nothing but the crumpled figure on the ground. He ignored the reporter, whose mouth hung open mid-sentence. He ignored the police officers, who looked on with bewildered confusion. He knelt on the cold pavement beside Elena, the fabric of his $1,000 suit brushing against the grit and grime of the street. His gaze fell upon the faded photograph lying beside her spilled belongings. He saw his sister's face, a ghost from a sunnier time. And then he looked at Elena, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a problem, but as a messenger from a life he had buried long ago. Elena flinched, pulling back as he approached, her body coiled in a protective crouch. She expected a final, cruel dismissal, an order to be dragged away, but the voice that spoke was not the cold, disembodied command from an intercom. It was fractured, raw, and trembling with an emotion she couldn't place. "You're Sophia's daughter," he whispered, the words more of a realization than a question. He gently picked up the photograph, his fingers tracing the image of the little girl. "I'm my sister Manlia." He looked up at Elena, his eyes swimming with 2 decades of unshed tears. "I am so sorry for all of this. Please, you must come inside." The offer was not charity. It was a plea for forgiveness, a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm of his own making. Hearing her mother's name from this stranger's lips was the key that unlocked her exhausted defenses. It was the sign she had been waiting for, the proof that her mother's memory of kindness was real. The fight went out of her, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness and a fragile flicker of relief. She gave a slow, hesitant nod, a silent acceptance that was steeped in dignity. Adrian extended a hand, not to command, but to support. As he helped her to her feet, he deliberately positioned himself between her and the gawking news camera, a human shield against the world's intrusive gaze. "Marcus," he said, his voice now laced with steel, "escort these people off my property. Now." He led Elena toward the gate, leaving the chaos behind them. Inside the mansion, the silence was vast and intimidating. The staff watched in disbelief as their reclusive employer guided the disheveled, pregnant woman through the marble foyer. He didn't take her into the main house. Instead, he led her to the small, charming gatehouse, a cottage nestled among the trees that had been vacant for years. It was a home, not a gilded cage. He turned to his housekeeper, his instructions clear and quiet. "Prepare this house immediately. Call Dr. Evans and have her come here. See to it that she has everything she needs. Food, clothes, rest. She is our guest." There was no room for questions. The order was absolute, a declaration that the old rules of this house no longer applied. A new kind of life had just crossed the threshold. Later that evening, Elena sat wrapped in a soft blanket in the gatehouse, a warm meal untouched on the table beside her. A doctor had confirmed that both she and the baby were exhausted but healthy. Through the window, she could see the lights of the main house, a distant fortress that no longer felt menacing. Adrian stood on his balcony, not watching her, but looking at the old photograph in his hands. He wasn't just giving her shelter, he was rebuilding a sanctuary. For Elena, it was the end of a desperate pilgrimage and the beginning of a life free from fear. For Adrian, it was the first step out of a prison of his own guilt. A quiet, unspoken pact had been formed, a promise that from the ashes of a shared sorrow, a new family might just find a way to grow. 3 months passed, each one a brushstroke painting a new world for Elena. The gatehouse was no longer a shelter, it was a home, filled with the scent of baby powder and the soft warmth of sunlight filtering through clean windows. She had given birth to a healthy girl, naming her Sophia, after the mother whose last wish had guided her here. The gnawing hunger and chilling cold were distant nightmares, replaced by the steady rhythm of a life rebuilt on a foundation of safety. She would often sit by the window, rocking her daughter, and look out at the grand mansion, not with fear or awe, but with a quiet sense of belonging. She was no longer a ghost at the gates. She was a guardian of this newfound peace, her strength no longer a desperate act of survival, but a calm, nurturing force. Adrian was a man remade. The monitors in his office now gathered dust, the fortress of his solitude breached by the sound of a baby's laughter carried on the breeze. He walked the grounds of his estate for the first time in years, not pacing like a prisoner, but observing the life that had returned to it. He would visit the gatehouse each day, his presence no longer an intrusion but a quiet ritual. He never came empty-handed, bringing not expensive gifts, but simple offerings. A book of poetry he'd loved as a boy, a freshly picked rose from Leah's favorite bush, a small, hand-carved wooden bird. He spoke little, but his eyes, once cold and empty, now held a light Elena recognized as hope. The guilt had not vanished, but it had transformed from a crushing weight into a gentle ache, a reminder of the love he was now capable of giving. The day Sophia was born was the day the mansion was truly reborn. Adrian had stood outside the hospital room, a silent, anxious sentinel. When the nurse finally brought the baby out, wrapped in a soft pink blanket, he flinched as if seeing a ghost. But as he looked into the infant's impossibly new eyes, he saw not the past, but the future. This tiny, perfect life was not a replacement for the one he had lost, but a continuation of it, a chance to finally get it right. The first time he held her, his hands trembled, his carefully constructed composure finally crumbling into a quiet, cleansing wave of tears. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire or a recluse. He was simply a man holding a miracle, finding in her weight the anchor his soul had been searching for. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Elena pushed Sophia in a stroller beneath the old oak tree, Adrian approached her. He didn't carry a flower or a book this time. In his hand was a single, ornate key attached to a simple leather cord. He stopped before her, a rare, hesitant smile on his face. "This isn't just for the gatehouse," he said, his voice soft. "It's for the main house, too. It's for the foundation I'm starting in Leah's name to help women and children like you. I want you to run it." He held out the key. It wasn't an offer of employment, it was a transfer of trust, of power. He was giving her the keys to his world, acknowledging that she, the woman he had once seen as a threat, was now its heart. Elena took the key, her fingers closing around the cool metal. She looked from his face to her daughter, sleeping peacefully in the stroller, and then back to the house that had once seemed so impenetrable. It was no longer a monument to wealth and sorrow, but a beacon of second chances. She had come here searching for a memory of kindness, and had found its source. She had arrived with nothing but a faded photograph and a desperate hope, and now she held the future in her hands. She didn't need to say thank you. The understanding that passed between them was deeper than words. It was a silent acknowledgement that they had saved each other. Two broken halves forming an unexpected, beautiful whole. Her pilgrimage was over. Her life had begun. He watched her place the key around her neck, where it rested like a medal of honor. The sunlight caught the tears in her eyes, turning them into diamonds. She had come to his door seeking a ghost and had, in turn, exorcised his. He had offered her shelter from the storm, and she had shown him how to live in the sun again. The world had judged her, called her a problem, a nuisance, a grifter. But she was none of those things. She was a testament to the fact that the most broken hearts often hold the greatest capacity for love, for in the end, she didn't just find a home, she became one. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and send this video to someone who needs to believe in hope.